For the last 5 weeks, we've been looking at David's greatest work, I think, the 23rd Psalm. I've been encouraging you to commit it to memory. So let's read it together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. His name was Eric Hill, and he had everything you'd ever need for a bright future. He was 28, a recent college graduate. He had an athletic frame. He had a soft smile. His family loved him. Girls took notice of him. Companies had contacted him about hiring him. And although he appeared totally composed without, he was tormented within. Tormented by voices that he could not still. Bothered by images he could not avoid. So hoping to get away from them all, one day he decided to get away from it all. On a gray, rainy day in February of 1982, he walked out the back door of his Florida home, and he never came back. His sister Debbie remembers watching him leave, his tall frame stumbling down the interstate. She thought he would return. He didn't. She hoped he would call. He didn't. She thought she'd be able to find him. She couldn't. Where Eric journeyed, only God and Eric knew, and neither of them chose to tell. What we do know is that Eric heard a voice, and in that voice was an assignment. And that assignment was to go along Interstate 10 near San Antonio, Texas, and continuously pick up trash. To the commuters on Interstate 10, his lanky frame and his full beard became a familiar sight. He made a home in a vacant lot. He made a wardrobe out of a split pair of trousers and a torn sweatshirt. An old hat helped him on the summer days. A plastic bag over his shoulders softened the winter chill. His weathered skin, his stooped shoulders made him look twice his 44 years. But then 16 years on the side of an interstate will do that to you. And that's how long it had been since Debbie had seen her brother. And she might not ever have seen him again if it weren't for 2 events. The first was the construction of a car dealership on the vacant lot that Eric had called home. The second was a severe pain in his abdomen. The dealership took his home, and the pain nearly took his life. EMS found him curled in a ball on the side of the road, clenching his stomach. The hospital ran some tests and discovered that he had cancer, terminal cancer. Another few months and he would be dead. And with no known family, no known relatives, they were afraid he would die alone. And his court-appointed attorney couldn't handle that thought. Surely someone is looking for Eric, she said. So the lawyer scoured the internet, hoping that someone was looking for Eric, hoping that someone was in search of a brown-haired adult male with the last name Hill. That's how she met Debbie. Her description seemed to match her memory, but she had to know for sure. So she left Florida. She left her home. Her and her husband and their 2 kids, they packed up and they headed to San Antonio. They rented a hotel room and they set out to find Eric. By now he had been released from the hospital, but the chaplain knew where he was. They found him sitting against a building not too far from the interstate. As they approached, he stood. They offered fruit, he refused. They offered juice, he declined. He was polite but unimpressed with his family who claimed to be his own. His interest did perk, though, when Debbie offered him a pin to wear, an angel pin. He said yes. Her first time to touch her brother in 16 years was the moment he allowed her to pin the angel on his shirt. She intended to stay a week, but a week passed, and she stayed. Her husband returned home. She stayed. Spring became summer. Eric improved, and she stayed. She rented an apartment. She began to homeschool her kids and never stopped reaching out to her brother. It wasn't easy. He didn't recognize her. He didn't know her. One day he even cursed her. He didn't want to sleep in her apartment. He didn't want her food. He didn't want to talk. He wanted his vacant lot. He wanted his job of picking up trash along the interstate. And he wondered who was this woman anyway. But she didn't give up. She understood that he didn't understand. So she stayed. One Sunday she found her way into a church and was talking to the pastor. He said, why? Why are you staying after all this many months? Why do you keep on reaching out to this one who has so clearly rejected you? Her answer was simple. He's my brother. And when I read his story, it reminded me of another story. Her heart reminded me of another heart. Her compassion reminded me of another type of compassion. Her heart reminded me of another heart who left home in search of the confused. Her compassion reminded me of a compassionate soul who couldn't bear the thought of a brother or a sister in pain. So like Debbie, he left home. And like Debbie, he found his sibling. And when Jesus found us, we were like Eric. Our limitations kept us from recognizing him. We didn't understand he had come to save us. We even doubted his presence, and sometimes we still do. So how does he deal with our doubts? Same way Debbie dealt with her brother's doubts. He follows us. He follows us. As Debbie followed Eric, God follows us. He pursues us until we finally see him as our Father, even if it takes all the days of our life. David finishes his masterpiece by saying, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That must be the sweetest phrase ever penned. Can we hear it from some other translations? Goodness and unfailing love, these will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord my whole life long, says one translation. Another says, I know your goodness, your love will be with me all my life, and your house will be my home as long as I live. The Message says, your beauty and love chase after me every day of my life. And I'm back home in the house of Yahweh for the rest of my life. You know, to read those verses, it's like to open a box of jewels. Each word sparkles. Each word begs to be scrutinized, to be examined. Goodness, mercy, all the days of my life, forever. Look at the first word. Surely. Surely. David didn't say maybe goodness and mercy will follow me. David didn't say possibly goodness and mercy will follow me. David didn't say I have a hunch that goodness and mercy will follow me. David could have used any of those phrases, but he didn't. David believed in a sure God. He believed in a God who makes his promises, in a God who keeps his promises, in a God who provides a sure foundation. David would have loved the words of his great-great-grandson, the Apostle James, who said in James 1:17, describing God as the one with whom there is never the slightest variation or the shadow of inconsistency. Our moods may shift. God's doesn't. Our minds may change, but God doesn't. Our devotion may falter, but God's devotion never does. Even if we are faithless, He is faithful. He is a sure God. And we can state confidently because of that surely goodness and mercy will follow us all the days of our life. Goodness and mercy. Now think about this. This is good. I didn't come up with it, but it's still good. If the Lord is our shepherd, then goodness and mercy are the two sheepdogs guarding the rear of the flock. The Lord's the shepherd at the front of the flock. And we've got two sheepdogs, goodness and mercy, following the flock at the back to make sure that we get to our destination safely. And notice it's not goodness or mercy, but it's goodness and mercy. Not goodness alone, for we are all sinners in need of mercy. And not mercy alone, for we are fragile and we are in need of the goodness of God. We need them both. We need them both. One man wrote this: goodness to supply every want and mercy to forgive every sin. Goodness to provide, mercy to pardon. What a huge statement. Look at the size of it. Goodness, mercy. And he finishes it though. All the days of my life. What a huge statement. Goodness and mercy will follow the Lord's children every day of their life. Think of the days ahead. What do you see? Days at home with the toddler that's going to get on your nerves every day, and it's just you and that toddler? God will be at your side. He'll take your hand. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me, not some, not nearly all, but all the days of my life. And I love one more word, that word, follow. And you know, when I read that word, that surely goodness and mercy shall follow me, it's almost surprising. And it's an odd way of describing God, a God who follows us. But there are many scriptures who say that that's true. You know, you have to go no farther than the 3rd chapter of the Bible, Genesis chapter 3, to see it. Adam and Eve had sinned. They hid from God, and God comes looking for them. Now, God could have come and said, okay, I don't see him. I'm just going to go back. But that's not what God did. God comes reaching out to the evil, to sinful, to rebellious humankind. And he comes with the words, "Where are you?" Even in the midst of their rebellion, even in the midst of their sin, even in the midst of their tragedy, God comes to follow them. Moses can tell you about it. He was 40 years in the desert when he looked over his shoulder and he saw a burning bush. God had followed him in the wilderness. Jonah can tell you about it. He was a fugitive on a boat. When he looked over his shoulders, he saw the clouds were rising. God was sending a storm. God was following Jonah. The disciples of Jesus knew about it. They were rain-soaked, they were shivering, and they looked over their shoulder and they see Jesus walking towards them. In the midst of the storm, God was following them. An unnamed Samaritan woman knows the same. She was alone in life, and she was alone at the well. None of the other women cared to have anything to do with her. And one day she looked over her shoulder and she saw a man who cared enough about her to follow her to a well and to offer her living water. John the Apostle knew all about it. Banished onto the Isle of Patmos, when he looked over his shoulder, he sees the skies begin to open, and God followed him into exile and gave him the revelation of Jesus Christ. Lazarus had been dead 3 days. He'd been put in a tomb. When he heard a voice, he lifted his head, he looked over his shoulder, and he saw Jesus standing there. God had even followed him till death. Peter denied his Lord. He went back to fishing, and he heard his name, and he looked over his shoulder, and he saw Jesus coming back cooking breakfast. God had followed him in spite of his failures. God is the God who follows. I wonder, have you sensed him following you? Have you sensed God following you? Dr. Henry Ironside was a great preacher, and he used to be pastor of Moody Church in Chicago. And he told the story of a poor little old lady who lived by herself. Somehow she had convinced herself that she was being followed by 2 men everywhere she went. And she kind of developed some phobia about it. She tried psychiatrists, she tried counselors, she would regularly call the police, but nobody could help her because nobody was following her. Finally, she went to her pastor, and she told him, she said, "Preacher, everywhere I go, 2 men are following me. When I go to the grocery store, they follow me. When I get on the streetcar, they follow me. Wherever I go, when I'm at home, they're right there behind me. I go to my bedroom, they're right there at my bed." He said, "Well, have you reported to the police?" She said, "Oh, yes. But they say they're not there." "But preacher, I know they are. Can you help me?" And at that moment, the Holy Spirit spoke to Dr. Ironside. And he put his arm on that dear lady and he said, "You are one of the most blessed women I've ever met." She said, "I am? How? How do you figure that?" He said, "Don't you know who those 2 men are?" She said, "No, do you?" He said, "Oh, yes. They're David's friends." And he turned to the 23rd Psalm and he read her these words, "Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life." He said, "Sweet lady, those 2 men are goodness and mercy, and God has sent them to you to follow you all the days of your life." And she said, "Pastor, that's wonderful. And to think all this time I'd been afraid of them." And from that day on, she would go to the streetcar, and before she would get on, she would wait for goodness and mercy to get on with her. When she went to her apartment, she had opened the door and let goodness and mercy go in with her. She lived the rest of her life that way, always secure in the fact that goodness and mercy were following her. They're not imaginary. They are real. You might not can see them, but you sure will be able to sense them. Now, David finishes with one tiny little word, and. Because what he's about to do is he's going to connect the present that goodness and mercy are behind us with the future. And he says, I will dwell, I will live in the house of the Lord forever. Now that was good news for a shepherd. It's good news for us, but it was really good news for a shepherd. You know why? Shepherd never had a home. A shepherd was always with his sheep, and the sheep always had to have grass to eat. So the shepherd would go from one pasture to another, always on the move, always looking for the next place to go, because the sheep always had to be fed. The shepherd never had a home. But David looked into the future, and David said, but one day I'm going to have a home. One day I'm going to have a place where I can dwell. And you know, there's no better feeling than to be at home. I cannot tell you. You know, I was with a bunch of ladies all this week, and we went to West Virginia, Indiana, Kentucky, Ohio. And I could not wait to see those lights on 58. When I saw all those lights on 58, you know what I knew? I was home. And there was no greater feeling than to know that I was home. I was home. And David says, I've got a home with the Lord all the days of my life. Forever. I love that word. Forever. As David knew that the Lord is your shepherd, then you have a home too. Then you have a home too. Then you don't have to go through this life wandering around, and until you get there, surely goodness and mercy, they'll be following you. And what's their reason? To make sure you get home safely. A lady who had been diagnosed with a terminal illness, been given 3 months to live, was getting her things in order. She contacted her pastor, had him come to her house to discuss her funeral, what she wanted to be done. She wanted to be buried with her favorite Bible. And they talked about everything, and the pastor was getting ready to leave, and the woman said, but there's one more thing, Pastor. Something very important. He said, what's that? She said, well, it's very important. I want to be buried with the fork in my right hand. And the pastor looked at her for a moment, thought she had lost her mind, and he didn't really know what to say. But she continued. She said, I know you think it's strange, but in all my years of attending church socials and potlucks, I always remember that when the dishes of the main course were being cleared, someone would always lean over and say, keep your fork. And that was my favorite part, because I knew something better was coming. Chocolate cake, banana pudding, apple pie, pecan pie, something good, something wonderful, something sweet was on its way. She said, when people walk by my casket, I want them to see the fork in my hand. I want them to see the look on my face. And I want them to say what's with the fork. And preacher, I want you to tell them, keep your fork if you're a child of God, because the best is yet to come. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and the best is yet to come. Why? The Lord's my shepherd. And all God's children said, amen.